Welcome everyone. It's the third year in a row. I want to salute the fact that the core group is growing. I understand that last year Colombia, Uruguay and the UK joined, and this year we can welcome Australia and Chile, and we are also happy to have welcomed Albania as an observer state to our core group. I think that's a great result. I want to reiterate for those of you who might not have noticed that I am extremely attached to this initiative. I'm very happy to be back here, although in a different capacity, but also in this capacity I want to take LGBTI rights to the next level, and that is very necessary indeed. Let me quickly run you through the program. We have the great honor to be joined by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, whose leadership on these issues and fidelity to the core group we are extremely grateful for. He's been our friend from the beginning, and he will remain our friend, and I'm personally extremely grateful to you for that, Secretary General. As you know, the Secretary General is very busy, has multiple high-level events at the same time in parallel through the UN, and his attendance is required in many places. For this reason, he will need to leave promptly at 5:30. He's grateful for your understanding and support for this, but I'm sure everyone in the room understands. We then have two very esteemed speakers, His Excellency Festus Mogae, the former President of the Republic of Botswana, and Mrs. Hina Jilani, who is a human rights lawyer and pro-democracy campaigner and a member of the Elders. We then have a short film before Eduardo Zuain will deliver the concluding remarks. The pledge to leave no one behind, which is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Summit, sums up very neatly also why we are here today. Human rights for everyone. LGBTI people should be treated the same way as other people, have the same opportunities, the same rights, the rights that they are entitled to. No more, no less. We're not here to impose our views on others who don't share them. We just want to dispel fear. There is no reason for fear. It ain't contagious, as they say. There is no reason for homophobia. And I understood that last night in his speech, President Mogae wanted to share with us the fact that he's not gay. Neither am I, but it doesn't prevent me from coming up for the rights of gay people just as I would come up for the rights of any other human being. This August, for the very first time in 70 years, the UN Security Council held its first ever discussion on LGBT rights. I want to bow to Chile and the United States, thank you very much, Samantha, for making this happen. And I really want to salute Adnan and Subi, who were targeted by ISIS for being gay, respectively, in Iraq and Syria, for the incredible courage to testify before the world community. This is truly breaking the silence. This is what we need, but I've spoken too long already. I gladly give the floor to His Excellency, the Secretary General.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Mr. Frans Timmermans, First Vice President of European Union. Your Excellency, Mr. Bart Koenders, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Netherlands. And Your Excellency, Mr. Festus Mogae, former President of Botswana, Ms. Hina Jilani of the Elders, distinguished ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your warm welcome and very kind words. I'm grateful to every member of the LGBT core group. You stand with me in defending human rights for all people. Thanks to you, the United Nations is moving closer to fulfilling the mission entrusted to us 70 years ago. Our Charter reaffirms the fundamental human rights, dignity, and worth of every single person. Leaders from around the world have just adopted a new vision of sustainable development. There are 17 sustainable development goals, all based on a single guiding principle: to leave no one behind. We will only realize this vision if we reach all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In too many countries, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people are among the poorest, most marginalized members of the society. We need more data to get a clear picture, but we already know that gay affluence is largely a myth. Studies show that gay and lesbian people suffer disproportionate discrimination and abuse. They are rejected by their families, kicked out of their homes, and pushed out of school. Too many of our LGBT brothers and sisters are jobless, homeless, and struggling to survive. The situation of transgender people is even worse overall. They have higher rates of homelessness, poverty, and hunger. For individuals and their families, this is a personal tragedy. And for society, it is a shameful waste of human talent, ingenuity, and economic potential. All members of this core group understand that ending marginalization and exclusion of LGBT people is a human rights priority and a development imperative. We are here together to break down the barriers that prevent LGBT people from exercising their full human rights. When we do that, we will liberate them to fully and productively contribute to our common economic progress. The investment we make in eliminating intolerance and hate will bring huge benefits across the global agenda. We can create a world where all people are free and equal, as our campaign is called. We can show future generations that the best way to advance our shared goals is to embrace all members of our human family, regardless of who they are or whom they love. Ladies and gentlemen, this year I was privileged to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco in June. San Francisco, the city where United Nations was born. After that ceremony, I was truly proud and honored to receive the Harvey Milk Award for the UN's free and equal campaign against homophobia and transphobia. More than 30 years ago, Harvey Milk lost his life fighting for equality when he was shot to death in San Francisco's City Hall. Looking at me, you would think I have very little in common with Harvey Milk. I would never claim to be as courageous as he was, but I'm totally committed to this cause. Growing up in the Republic of Korea, you know what kind of society it is. We didn't talk even about sexual orientation or gender identity. We couldn't. Not that I didn't, but I couldn't. But as Secretary General of the United Nations, I learned to speak out because this is a matter of life and death. I stand with the gay teen who is bullied, the transgender woman denied work, the lesbian subjected to vicious sexual assault. Let me say a word about my personal diplomacy to fight discrimination against LGBT people. I have been urging many world leaders whose countries have harsh domestic policies to amend them. Sometimes I was successful. Sometimes mostly I have not been successful. But sometimes my relationship with a certain very powerful member state have been very, very difficult because of my just a statement after statement and meeting people like this. But I will continue to fight until all LGBT people can live freely without suffering any intimidation or discrimination. In that regard, let me just explain two episodes how I've been doing this. When I first elected Secretary General, we've been talking about this LGBT, but I knew that a lot of our staff, LGBT people, were hiding and without coming out. Then one day they asked for a meeting with me. So I met about a dozen of UN staff. They came, of course, whoever comes to my office, photographer takes photograph. They refuse to take photograph. Then I asked why. Because once a photograph is taken, it's official. So they were very much afraid to be exposed. So I told them that, well, then in such a case, I respect your wish, but I will keep for my own purpose. I will not disclose it, and I'll give it to you personally. Then they agreed. Then we were talking about all this. Next year, following year, they came out and they made a calendar. 12 calendars, 12-month calendars with their photos, all this. That's a huge change. I declare that I will make United Nations the best possible working place for LGBT peoples to work. Thank you very much. Another story. This is a really dramatic fighting. In 2010 May, I visited Malawi. If you check all this record, you might have seen at that time it became a big issue in human rights community. Then a gay couple was imprisoned in Malawi. Around that time, I was paying an official visit. I met the president. The president, he died unfortunately after that. The Professor Mutharika. Then his brother is now president, another Mutharika. But I had a good meeting with him. Then after that, privately, I told him, I appealed to him, Mr. President, I read this article in the newspaper. This is too harsh. Just because they are gay couple, these two men were put into prison for many years, hard labor, something like this. Then I explained and appealed. If whatever you can, please show some generous and kind support and consideration. Then he said that I don't agree with you. These people should be punished. This, we have domestic regulations. Then he said, since you are Secretary General of the UN, let me think about that. I was very glad that. I thought it would take several months. When we were having joint press stakeout, suddenly, without notifying me, he said, I am going to pardon this gay upon Secretary General's request with immediate effect. They were released immediately that day. That was one successful story. I moved to another country, neighboring country. I failed. I again talked a lot with the president, but he didn't. But yes, still, that country is still not doing enough. In any way, when the human rights of LGBT people are abused, all of us are diminished. Every human life is precious. None is worth more than another. This is United Nations. I lead will never stop in the fight against the discrimination. We will never shy away from protecting the most marginalized and vulnerable people. This is not just a personal commitment, it's an institutional commitment. Some say I am the first Secretary General to take up this course, but I prefer to say that I am the first of many. To lead this organization means to carry out as a sacred mission to deliver human rights for all people. We keep advancing. Earlier today, a dozen UN agencies issued the first ever joint UN statement on combating violence and discrimination against LGBT and intersex persons. I applaud them for speaking in one voice on this critical issue. And I say to members of the LGBT community, the United Nations will always stand with you in your fight for recognition, respect, and right. Let us unite for a better world for all people. And thank you for your leadership and commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. People, I don't know about you, but I think he deserves a standing ovation for this.
Thank you.
It's at moments like this that I think we'll get there. We'll get there. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Festus Mogae, the former President of the Republic of Botswana, who has led relentless efforts to decriminalize homosexuality and to fight AIDS. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, sir, thank you very much. Secretary General, sir, honorable ministers, distinguished attendants, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to borrow the words from one of the most renowned humanitarians of our century, Mother Teresa, to the effect that human rights are not a privilege conferred by government. They are every human being's entitlement by virtue of their being part of humanity. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights also states that all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Protection of the rights of all sectors of the population, no matter how small the sector, remains one of the most fundamental responsibilities for any leader. A leader is not only responsible to the most powerful group, the richest, the loudest, the largest, or those with similar political orientation. The smallest, most vulnerable, most disenfranchised, most excluded, most discriminated sectors of the population should remain highest in any leader's priority and must be protected. The laws in many of our countries in Africa dehumanize those at highest risk of HIV, for instance, such as sex workers, lesbians, gay, bisexual, and transgender, people who use drugs, prisoners, and migrants. Yet our constitutions clearly articulate equality for all. Rather than providing the protection, these laws render those sectors of our societies much more vulnerable to HIV and unnecessary death due to AIDS-related illnesses. We have seen how in our continent, discrimination and stigma have continued to fuel the AIDS epidemic. We have learned over the years that as far as AIDS is concerned, bad laws fuel the epidemic. My thoughts and sentiments today are premised on a fact proven over and over again, that one of the biggest barriers to HIV prevention, treatment, and care and support is discrimination and stigma. That where stigma and discrimination exist, then people are much more likely to be afraid to seek out information, services, and other means of prevention, treatment, care, and support. That because of fear of stigma and discrimination, people are most likely not going to disclose their status to their families and partners for fear of, among others, rejection and above all, violence. Again, that the fear of the ramifications of discriminatory laws does undermine people's willingness to seek services and support. This is not only a fact for AIDS, but for most challenges facing our populations and nations. You will forgive me, good people, because we are talking about the human rights of LGBT. We're not talking about AIDS. But I come from sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa in particular, which is the most seriously affected region of the world by HIV and AIDS. That is why, in the context of human rights, I keep on referring to that fact also. In Africa, one of the most fundamental ideals we fought for is that of non-discrimination on grounds of skin color, gender, religious orientation, and other beliefs. We are supposed to uphold these ideals passionately. Yet, ironically, discrimination against LGBT is still upheld and justified by our same nations and our laws. We have seen violence perpetrated against LGBT in at least 3 of our countries, in East, Central, and West Africa. As champions for an AIDS-free generation, we have written and appealed to the leaders in these countries to reconsider their positions and the rights of LGBT, and we will continue with our advocacy until justice for all is attained. Chairperson Sewon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the challenges faced by LGBT in the West and elsewhere, in comparison to those of their counterparts in Africa, are very light. We have seen how LGBT in some of our countries, when I say our, I mean African countries. That's where I come from. And that's where the problem is most severe. Therefore, I was saying that as we have seen LGBT in some of our countries have been discriminated and stigmatized when they stood for their own human and democratic rights. We have seen the very harsh and violent environments in which they exist on the African continent. We have seen how our leaders and populations have stoked the fires of their violation and watched and justified their suffering. Adolescent and young people, LGBT, are at highest risk of HIV infection globally, but especially in Africa. They face double discrimination and stigma. They face violence, are often excluded from services, and face other human rights violations. It is our duty as adults and leaders to protect these young people against these violations and ensure that they grow up with full access to information, testing, treatment, and other sexual and reproductive services. They have a right to life, to health, and to freedom from discrimination like everybody else. But you know, despite the destruction that AIDS has had on our nations, AIDS has helped to shatter the silence on issues that our governments and leaders have found the greatest difficulty in addressing. AIDS activism has forced our leaders and governments to address AIDS and LGBT issues. We have seen some progress, however very slow, in some of our countries where colonially inherited laws discriminating against LGBT have been repealed. Same-sex sexual activity, the most basic of rights, is now legal in 25 countries in Africa. For the rest of our countries, same-sex sexual activity is punishable by imprisonment of different periods up to life, and going as far as the death penalty. South Africa is the most progressive country in Africa in all LGBT rights and laws. In my own Southern Africa region, the most seriously affected by HIV and AIDS, only 3 countries do not criminalize same-sex and sexual activity for both men and women. In 4 countries, it is not criminalized for women only, while in the remainder, it is criminalized for both sexes. The group which I chair, calling itself Champions for an HIV-Free Generation, is committed to speaking out strongly against discrimination of all groups, especially that of LGBT. Fear of arrest drives the LGBT and other marginalized communities underground, away from information, treatment, and care, therefore fueling the epidemic and unnecessary death and suffering. Our position is that if some sectors of our population are left behind, we cannot claim to be working towards ending AIDS, and we cannot claim to have ended AIDS in our countries, on our continent, and globally. In conclusion, let me appeal once more, with a bent knee and cap in hand, to my leaders in Africa to note that human rights are inalienable and absolute. They cannot change to suit certain sectors or certain circumstances or certain regions or countries of the world. They are inherent entitlements. Simply by virtue of being a human being, one is entitled to these rights. They should be applicable equally throughout the world. I repeat that bad laws, discrimination, violence, and stigma fuel the epidemic in Africa. As long as this exists, we cannot end AIDS. Africa must break down the barriers and obstacles that fuel discrimination against all groups, especially the LGBT. If we do not act now with purpose, urgency, and inclusivity, we risk the danger of deepening the divisions in our communities, of creating divisive and unjust societies, a legacy of hate and fear for future African generations. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Secretary General, I thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Mogae. You know, homophobia and legal discrimination against gays was introduced in Africa by Europeans. And therefore, it's mind-boggling that sometimes you hear Africans argue that it's part of their culture not to respect the human rights of gays, I would suggest they get in touch with their culture and their history. They would understand that it's much to our shame a European invention to discriminate against gays. It's much to our shame a European invention to create laws that would discriminate against gays. Who's switching off the light now? Is it something I said? I hope not. It is my great pleasure now to give the floor to Ms. Hina Jilani, who's a member of the Elders, and she's fought for human rights all her professional life. She's a strong pro-democracy campaigner, and she's a member of that incredible group, the Elders. One of her co-elders, Desmond Tutu, once said that if there is a homophobic heaven, don't believe there is, he said. It can't be true that there is a homophobic heaven, but if there is a homophobic heaven, I'd rather go to the other place. Ms. Jilani, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all express my deep sense of appreciation for the initiative that the LGBT core group of states has taken to hold this side event. This is an important discussion that must be continued, regardless of the pace at which we achieve progress in protecting the rights of LGBTI people and attaining an environment in this world that gives reality to all human rights for all. If this is not to become mere rhetoric, then I would say that it is imperative on every one of us sitting here to make sure that international human rights law, all standards and norms are not allowed to be used for excluding people from the protection of human rights. It was always meant to be inclusive. It should be inclusive. And any attempt to keep people outside of these protections must be dealt with a full commitment by those who uphold values of human rights. I therefore find it very strange that even today we are confronted with an argument from many governments and some societies that the human rights law does not make the right to a sexual orientation or does not include freedom of choice in the fundamental rights protected under international treaties. I find it strange because that argument would in fact lead us to think that the right to life is limited to only some categories and others can be excluded from it, that the right to be protected against torture is only for some people and not the jus cogens that we know it to be. This is a right that can under no circumstances be circumscribed. And yet, we see, especially in the context of LGBTI people, physical and mental torture becoming a norm in their everyday lives. They are physically attacked, brutalized. Their very identity and sexual orientation has to be hidden in many of our societies, causing distress and a continuous mental torture. But above all, ladies and gentlemen, the core right to dignity of the human person is denied to people in the name of culture, in the name of religion and morality. We as women know the distress of living these taboos. And I therefore ask not just women, but also the human race to understand what it means to be excluded from the protection of dignity and of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have to go through the kind of violence that is perpetrated every day and information on which has been painstakingly collected throughout the world by several agencies, both multilateral organizations like the UN, the NGO sector, the civil society. So it is very apparent to us the kind of violence that LGBTI people experience. What I need to point out, however, that it is not just violence that has to be combated in this particular case. We must see that this violence takes on even more sinister forms than the violence we confront in terms of women, in terms of children, and other forms of violence in situations of conflict. The brutality of it is far exceeded by the concerns on the whole notion of organized violence, where it seems that certain portions of the human race have a pact to collaborate on committing violence, on inflicting injury, on inflicting indignity and insult and humiliation on a certain category of human beings. The other important aspect that comes to my mind is the fact that those who have a responsibility to protect are sometimes the biggest violators of the rights of LGBTI people. Administrative structures, law enforcement structures have been found to be those that have committed violation of the rights as well as violence on LGBTI people. And this is reported from all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was holding the mandate on human rights defenders, I was appalled how the right to defend human rights was violated of those defenders who were defending the rights of LGBTI people. Human rights defenders working and engaging with the rights and promotion of the rights of the LGBTI people were killed, humiliated, arrested, tortured with impunity. And there was no agency in some countries that found such torture, such violations worthy of state concern. Ladies and gentlemen, when we see these things happening, instead of being frustrated, people like me who are human rights defenders put more vigor and more energy in our work for defending human rights. And I see that happening also with those who are defending the rights of the LGBTI people. You can't defeat them. They will never be defeated, and that is what gives me hope. Rather than any hope or expectation of an international convention or treaty respecting the rights of LGBTI people. I may also end by saying that there is really no reason to be hopeless. Progress is happening in the most unlikely places, I can tell you. In Pakistan, for instance, the Supreme Court of Pakistan has for the first time taken up the case of LGBTI people. The relief that the Supreme Court has given may still be limited because it only concerns gender identity, but does not stretch to the right to have a sexual orientation respected. So, what the Supreme Court has done is to give the LGBTI people the dignity of having an identity. The third gender is now recognized in Pakistan's law. Many of the LGBTI community now have the same civil rights as other Pakistani citizens in matters of inheritance, employment, and election registration. While I felt that this was very limited, this will eventually have to be expanded. Looking at the condition of LGBTI people in Pakistan, no judicial authority can ignore the aspect of violence. And when examining the aspect of violence, they will come across the whole question of sexual orientation, because violence in this instance means exploitation, sexual harassment, sexual assaults on the basis of gender. So let me say in the end, ladies and gentlemen, as a human rights defender, I see in my fellow defenders a determination to fight for this right. I know we have won very difficult battles in the past, and I am sure that this is a battle that we are not going to lose. For countries where culture has become a barrier, let me end by quoting the Secretary General when he said some time back, "When there is a tension between cultural attitudes and universal human rights, rights must carry the day." And that is how it will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. I think now is the time to watch Voices from the Front Lines.
Практически первая или там вторая пуля попала мне сразу в глаз, прямо в глаз. Я сразу же закрыл этот глаз и спрятался за угол. Крикнули: "Куда побежал, пидор?" Опыт общения с полицией навел на ощущение того, что для них абсолютно не важно, что произошло.
At the age of 16 again, my stepfather, who was a pastor, chased me out of the house because of my lesbian identity. I was beaten up with a bottle, repeatedly beaten up and raped.
The next thing I know, the judge sentenced me to 3 months imprisonment. These wardens, they actually purposely asked me to show my breast in front of all the other inmates from one cell to the other cell.
Ils m'ont arrêté, ils m'ont amené en cellule. J'ai refusé de répondre à leurs questions. Alors ils ont commencé à me torturer. Ils m'ont fait des choses horribles. Ils m'ont demandé de me déshabiller, de bander pour prouver que je suis un homme. Tout le monde me dit, tout le monde me considère comme un diable, comme un démon.
I think my parents suspected I was gay, and that was when they started taking me to, witch doctors and pastors, and until I was 14, I think what was really going on, and I'm like, you're gay, that's why they're trying to cure you. So it was when I was 17 that I actually took the step to tell them this is who I am, and I had to leave.
Меня уволили с работы сразу. Все мои родственники сказали: "Мы не хотим тебя знать. То есть никто вообще не захотел даже слушать меня.
Being proud and being accepting of yourself is the first way that someone else would be proud and accepting of you.
My husband took him a very long time to accept it. He would say, no, not in my house. Then I sat down with him. I said, this is who she is, so we can't change it. All we have to do is to accept it.
Eduardo, can I ask you to give us your concluding remarks?
Okay. All that we have to know, yes? Okay, dear colleagues and friends, for the third year in a row, we are here to renew our commitment in the fight against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I would like to welcome that since 2011, 14 states have adopted or strengthened anti-discrimination and hate crime law, extending protection on ground of sexual orientation and or gender identity, as it was reflected in the latest report of High Commissioner for Human Rights. I would also like to congratulate Finland, Slovenia, Ireland, and the United States for the huge steps that they have taken since our last meeting, in order to show the group of countries for different regions and continents which allow same-sex marriage. Making clear that our maximum goal is to achieve the full realization of recognition of the right of LGBTI people, leaving no one behind, our most urgent objective must be to end violence against people for their sexual orientation or gender identity. This is a reality that continues to happen every day in every country of every continent, and that must be stopped. Although the progress achieved so far and the fact that the international community is becoming less discriminatory, as long as there is a person who suffers from violence for the mere fact of being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or intersex, our job will not be complete. In this century, at least 76 states still retain laws that are used to criminalize people on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. 5 countries even penalize homosexuality with death penalty. This legislation are not in breach of international human rights since they violate the international recognized rights to privacy and non-discrimination. Argentina is well known for its policy for recognition of LGBTI rights, a process that was sped up in the last decade through the enacting of legislation providing for the same-sex marriage and gender identity in 2010 and 2012. While knowing that countries got a different path and that there are no universal receipts, I strongly believe that we should act together and show our voices to call for the universal recognition of the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity, and that the full respect of human rights should be guaranteed to all of them. This is not at all about imposing a model of legislation or cultural values. This is about firmly believing that, as states, we have the responsibility to ensure the full enjoyment of human rights for all human beings, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It is an honor for me to be responsible of closing this high-level event, taking into account that the fight against discrimination of LGBTI people was not even an issue of debate in the international community not so long ago. In the name of Call Group, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all speakers and guests who joined us today. The commitment of countries like those present here today
as well as the civil society around the world, were key in including our human rights agenda the end of discrimination and violence against people for their sexual orientation or gender identity. In this sense, and before concluding, I would like to welcome the joint statement made by 12 UN agencies, which was announced today. This expression of principle and commitment shows the growing interest and clear support that ending violence against LGBTI people has across the UN system. Dear colleagues, let's keep on working together in reaching out to those running behind. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you very much, and thank you also for your leadership throughout the years. I want to note, especially tonight, the credible leadership from the whole of Latin America on this issue. And I believe that without your leadership, we would not be where we are today. I remember, friends, where we were 3 years ago. You could only fit a few people in the room then, eh? Look at where we are now. Look at where we are now. So whenever you might feel discouraged because a leader gets applause for taking a cheap shot at gays, whenever you're discouraged because you hear legislation being enforced that should no longer be part of any legislation, whenever you hear of a gay person being attacked in the streets, don't be discouraged. Take home what you see here. Convince friends and family that you're fighting the good fight. And look back over the years and see what has been achieved. And my conclusion is, my friends, you are unstoppable. Thank you very much.